Leonard Nimoy's portrayal of Mr. Spock in the television series Star Trek is one of the most recognizable and loved characterizations in popular culture. His single raised eyebrow and the curiosity with which he said "fascinating" at an illogical emotional outbreak define the icon. In his book, I Am Spock, the actor-director gives his perspectives on the Star Trek phenomenon, his relationship with his co-stars, and the creation of the beloved pointy-eared alien, Mr. Spock. I'm pleased to have director Leonard Nimoy here with us this evening. Welcome.
Thank you.
I remember, as so many people do, an earlier biography of yours called I Am Not Spock. Are you or are you not?
Well, I am. I always have been. I always have been. It's a question of semantics. The original, was an attempt to come to grips with a question about how actors are perceived. If you're perceived as the character you portray, or is it clearly understood that you are the actor who is portraying the character? And it's in our language. We'll refer to an actor very often by the name of the character he plays. He is this character. Right. He is. You've seen so and so.
Well, Peter Falk is Columbo.
Exactly. So. And I had an experience once that I thought defined that issue. A lady stopped me at an airport, having recognized me, and introduced me to her little 6 or 7-year-old boy and said, "This is Mr. Spock." And he wouldn't buy it. He just kept staring at me. Yeah. And I understood that he wasn't ready to accept that shortcut in language yet. And I wrote about that. I wrote about that issue in the first book. And that's what the title grew out of. I was not Spock for him that day. And that's what I was dealing with. And now I'm having some fun with the title, and I've come to terms with the character.
Yeah. How have you come to terms with the character?
In this book, I have a series of dialogues which I hope punctuate the arc of the relationship at various stages along the way of what I'm experiencing in my work as the actor portraying the character, and where I think the character is at this particular point in the arc. I'm talking about over the last 20 years since the last book was published, and particularly dealing with the 6 films that have been made during that period of time, 2 of which I directed, 1 of which I produced. Right. So I had a very heavy involvement in the life and death and then resurrection of the character. And finally, I reached a point in the last movie in which I appeared, in a scene with Bill Shatner, who plays Kirk, of course. Right. Spock and Kirk are reminiscing as a couple of old guys, looking back on things, and Spock is somewhat disillusioned because of what has happened in this particular story. And he says to Kirk something like, "Is it possible that we two, you and I, have become so rigid and so inflexible as to have outlived our usefulness?" And as I said it, and I'm looking at Bill, and I thought to myself, I could be asking Bill Shatner the same question about us in Star Trek.
Yeah.
And the mask slipped away and intrigued me again. I thought I've just found a defining moment here. The character and the actor have merged in their life experience at this point. It's Spock talking to Kirk. It could be Nimoy talking to Shatner.
Let me go back and come back to that point, but go back to the beginning and the shaping of the character. How much of you infused that character and defined him?
I had to find him, but once I did, I think I made a contribution. I had to find him. I wasn't Spock to begin with. Sure. I wasn't Spock-like. I was impassioned, and I was taught to be emotional as an actor. I learned to express emotion, not to repress it or suppress it. So it was against the grain that I was working, that I was helped by directors to find the way. The first time I said fascinating, I said it wrong. There was something happening in the dramatic scene, and I, as Spock, said fascinating. And the director said, no, cool it out and do the scientific, curious approach to it. And I thought, oh, interesting. I'm going to lose this moment here because I should be part of the scene. And I didn't realize that I would establish a very clear identity for myself simply by saying fascinating. And I did. And then the character began to emerge, and I began to understand the power of that.
How about the grip?
That was mine. It was one of those chancy things that might work and might become cartoony, but it worked in the context. It was a scene where Bill Shatner, as Kirk, had been split into 2 personalities by a malfunction on the ship. We were doing our version of Jekyll and Hyde, and the Dr. Hyde version of Kirk was about to kill the Mr. Jekyll character with a phaser, and it's written that Spock comes up behind the bad guy and hits him on the head with the butt of a gun, and I said, I don't think so. So the director said, what would you like to do? And I thought, well, let's try this, and I put the pinch on. Bill sold it. Bill froze up and dropped like a heap, and and it worked.
Yeah, speaking of Bill, are you two, was there ever tension between the two of you?
Yeah, we had sibling rivalry. Is the best way to describe it.
And did it boil over?
No, not really. No, it always stayed professional. There was always, the work was always got done properly and was paramount.
But how did it manifest itself?
It could be testy arguments in the front office over a script change or a character distortion.
But it was about...
It was about the work.
About the work. And about what? I mean, how would you make the argument for Spock or for your character? Or would it have to be the number of lines? Did it have to do
no,
with
it wasn't
how
quantity.
Your character was perceived, or what was inauthentic and not authentic? And
function. Whose function should this be? If there's a scientific piece of research to be done here or information delivered, I'd say I think it's a Spock function. If it's a command function, tell the ship where to go and so forth, or tell Scotty or Sulu what to do with the ship, that's a command function. When they would overlap, we'd get into gray areas and trouble.
If you had it to do over, I'm sure you would do this. You would play Spock. Would you handle it differently? Not the character, but how you have lived with it and handled it. I mean, this book is I Am Spock, and the other one is I Am Not Spock. It partly answers that. But do you know what I mean? I mean, could you...
I don't think I would have titled the other book I'm Not Spock. I was advised against it.
Yeah.
Publishers advised me against it. They said it's a negative title, and their concern was economic. They said negative titles don't sell well, and I wasn't going to live with that. I wasn't really as concerned with the economics as they were, and I was very swift with my response. I said, "What about Gone with the Wind?" And I won the argument. And they said, "Look, it's your book. We'll do whatever you want." I would not have titled it that way. It caused me some grief. But you make mistakes. Yeah.
Did Gene Roddenberry, back to the business about Bill Shatner, didn't Roddenberry call in Isaac Asimov and to Asimov to do something about the relationship between those characters?
That's the legend. I've seen it in writing, and I've reported it in this book too. That's the legend, that he talked to Asimov about this rivalry.
Yeah.
Asimov said, make them inseparable, make them totally loyal to each other, make them as characters,
right.
And that the audience would then have a perception that when you thought of one, you thought of the other, and they were symbiotic, and it seemed to help.
You've answered this question 1,000 times, but one more time for me. How do you explain this success?
Yeah, Charlie, my explanation changes from day to day, and I'm sure it has to do with current events. And I say to myself, wouldn't it be nice in the near future, as we have in the 23rd century, to discover that we're in a society which is a meritocracy? Everybody gets the same breaks, everybody gets the same education, everybody gets the same kind of household and family life and so forth, and everybody gets the job that they really are qualified to do and holds the job if they do it well. Simple, plain and simple. There's no rhetoric, there's no backstabbing, there's no political infighting, no political agenda on anybody's part, and this is the Star Trek world, if you stop and think about it. It's a morally structured society. And I think it's a very, very desirable society. I wouldn't mind living
So there is a kind of psychic need for that in the part of people's lives, some kind of structured society, some kind of structure
morally
that
structured.
says a moral structure.
That you can count on as decent, that where the right thing where things work out properly, where people who are professionals work together to solve the problem. So problem solved. Start at square one. What's the next problem? Let's go to work again.
Did any of this involvement with this character make you interested in science fiction or in space or in...
Space, yeah. I think I've had a long interest in science fiction long before Star Trek. I read Tom Swift books when I was a kid, Tom Swift and his Flying Machine or whatever. And I was involved in science fiction long before Star Trek as an actor. My very first experience in science fiction was in a weekly theatrical serial called Zombies of the Stratosphere, and I'm here to admit that I played a zombie from the stratosphere. I did a lot of science fiction before Star Trek. But space, yes, and particularly in interplanetary communication. I'm fascinated by that.
What do you mean? You mean in terms of whether they're people...
I'm looking for the day that we hear from them, that the SETI program has their first contact and says, we have a signal that we believe is technically produced, not accidental, but intentionally produced by another civilization someplace.
Why do you believe they're there?
Well, I believe in the numeric aspects of it, the probabilities with so many thousands and thousands of other planets circling so many thousands of suns like ours. I believe the probabilities are great.
It would be arrogant for us to assume that we're the only.
Yeah, what's known as the Drake equation tells us that the chances are very, very good that there's a civilization out there.
When do you think we'll hear?
Could be any minute, John.
Maybe tonight, huh? In Search Of, any chance they'll bring that back?
I doubt it. I haven't heard any rumble. I did, about a year ago, have an inquiry about doing a couple of specials, and I've heard nothing since. We did 144 shows. It started out to be, I thought, a year or two, maybe 30, 40, 60 shows. We did 144 episodes. It was amazingly popular.
And how much involvement did you have in, other than just simply hosting it?
In some episodes, I had none except the hosting duties, and some I wrote, produced, directed. Depending on the subject matter, if it was something that I really had a lot of strong feeling about, I did the show myself.
Anything you really wanted to do that you haven't done?
No,
You've directed, you've acted, you've written,
I've produced.
Yeah.
I set out to make a living in the business, hopefully as an actor.
Right.
I find myself having had a wonderful directing run, and maybe more to come. I'm writing more than I ever expected to. I have the welcome mat is open in many places. I'm just a very lucky guy who's had a great run, 30 years as a result of Star Trek.
Do you consider 3 Men and a Baby the best directing you did?
No, it was certainly very successful.
Yeah, of course it was.
Commercially, the most successful thing I've ever done. Not necessarily the best. Star Trek 4 I'm very proud of. I did a movie with Diane Keaton and Liam Neeson, which was not very successful commercially, because the story is essentially a tragic story, and it was called The Good Mother, based on Sue Miller's novel. I'm very proud of that film.
Yeah. What's next for you?
I'm going to direct a play. I have a novel in the works. Why are you laughing?
How much time does a man have in a day? You're going to direct a play in California?
Yeah, and then bring it to New York.
Yeah.
And
what's the novel about?
The novel is about a character that I'm developing who's here, implanted by an alien society to study humanity. For guess what reason? Because they are technologically advanced and extraordinarily successful technologically, but sociologically they're a mess, and they think humans have figured out how to do it. So they've sent an implant here to study the society.
And he may have another book to write, I Am Spock 2.
Right.
Leonard Nimoy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great
Sean.
to have you here.
Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us this evening. Look forward to seeing you next time. See you then.